It wasn't a request for a priest, not for a final meal. With only hours left on death row, an inmate made one last bizarre request: for the warden to deliver a simple game of chess on a piece of paper. A request so strange, the warden almost threw it away. But that single sheet of paper held a coded secret so explosive it would unravel a massive conspiracy and force the warden to break every rule he had ever lived by. The truth was never meant to be found. What was hidden in that chess game will shock you. So stay with me, because this story is a masterclass in revenge. Before we begin, do me a favor. Like this video, hit subscribe so you don't miss our next story, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. Our story starts inside the cold, gray walls of Blackwood Maximum Security Correctional Facility, a place where the clock was ticking down on a man's life. The world of Warden Samuel Graves was one of concrete, steel, and silence. It was a world measured in meticulously scheduled minutes, a kingdom built upon the unshakable foundation of procedure. For 30 years, he had been the final stop in the long, grinding journey of the justice system. He was not a judge or a juror. He was an administrator of consequences. And in his world, consequences were absolute. His office was a reflection of his soul, sterile, ordered, and devoid of sentiment. The only art on the wall was a framed copy of the state penal code, its text a sacred scripture. On his desk, a digital clock glowed with cold red numerals. It read 11:37 p.m. In exactly 20 hours and 23 minutes, inmate 1138, a man named Ethan Cole, was scheduled to die by lethal injection. The knock on his door was as punctual as everything else in Blackwood Maximum Security Prison. 2 guards, their faces impassive masks, escorted the inmate inside. This was Ethan Cole. Graves had reviewed the file a dozen times. Cole was convicted for the brutal murder of billionaire magnate Arthur Wallace. The evidence, the prosecution had said, was a mountain. Fingerprints, a flimsy alibi, a history of disgruntled employment. The media had painted him as a monster of envy, a nobody who had lashed out at the titan who fired him. But the man standing before him now did not look like a monster. He wasn't trembling. He wasn't weeping or begging. There was a strange, unsettling stillness about him, a composure that felt alien in this place of ultimate despair. His eyes, clear and direct, met the warden's gaze without fear. "You requested to see me, Mr. Cole," Graves said, his voice flat, a tool he used to maintain distance. "This is highly irregular." "I'm aware, Warden," Ethan replied, his voice even. "I won't take much of your time." He placed his cuffed hands on the polished surface of the warden's desk. He didn't ask for a priest, a final phone call to a loved one, or a special last meal. He slid a plain, sealed manila envelope across the desk. It made a soft, rasping sound against the wood. "I have one final request," Ethan said. Graves stared at the envelope, then at the prisoner. He'd heard every last request imaginable. Pleas for forgiveness, desperate claims of innocence, venomous curses. He was prepared for anything, or so he thought. "I need you to personally deliver this," Ethan continued, to a man named Alastair Finch. He was a friend of Mr. Wallace. Warden Graves's brow furrowed. This was not just irregular, it was absurd. "I am not a courier service, Mr. Cole." "It's a chess game," Ethan said, ignoring the warden's dismissal. The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but something like it. "A transcription of a game. Mr. Finch is a grandmaster. He'll understand its meaning. It's all I ask." The warden's mind, a machine of logic and procedure, recoiled. A chess game, a final, meaningless gesture from a man whose life had already been forfeited. His first instinct was to refuse, to slide the envelope into the shredder and remind the inmate of his place. This was a mockery of the solemnity of the process. It was a game, and this was not a place for games. Yet he didn't. He couldn't. Something held him back. It was Ethan's calm. The profound lack of desperation was a crack in the predictable facade of death row. Killers, in his experience, were either broken or defiant. They were loud. Ethan Cole was quiet. It was the quiet that was so profoundly unsettling. It was a variable Graves could not account for, a piece on the board that didn't fit. "That's all?" Graves asked, the question sharper than he intended. "That's all," Ethan confirmed. The warden picked up the envelope. It felt impossibly light, as if it contained nothing at all. He stared at the man who would be dead in less than a day, a man who seemed more concerned with the delivery of a chess game than with his own mortality. It was in that moment that a tiny, irritating seed of curiosity was planted in the barren soil of the warden's procedural mind, and he knew, with a certainty that infuriated him, that it would not let him rest. Warden Graves's life was governed by a single, unshakable rule, a principle he had forged over 3 decades of walking the Green Mile with condemned men. He articulated it once to a young, idealistic chaplain who had dared to question the morality of his work. "Father," Graves had said, his voice as cold as the winter steel of the cell doors, "my job begins after the verdict. Guilt or innocence is not my concern. The moment they enter these walls, they are no longer men defined by their past actions, but by the sentence handed down to them. My duty is to that sentence. Compassion is a luxury this facility cannot afford. It is a poison that clouds judgment and corrodes the gears of the system. We are here to execute the will of the state, not to question it." This creed was his armor. It protected him from the harrowing reality of his profession. He saw the inmates not as people, but as files, as numbers, as sentences to be carried out. It was this detachment that allowed him to sleep at night, to sign the paperwork, to give the final nod. Ethan Cole's file number 1138, was a model of simplicity, a closed case. Arthur Wallace, a titan of industry, found dead in his study. Ethan Cole, a former data analyst for Wallace's firm, fired for insubordination, was the prime suspect. His fingerprints were on the murder weapon, a heavy crystal decanter. His alibi was a late-night walk, uncorroborated. He was represented by a court-appointed public defender, Marcus Thorne, who seemed to have mounted only the most perfunctory of defenses. The jury was out for less than 4 hours. The verdict was guilty. The sentence was death. It was all there in black and white, neat, tidy, an open and shut case, a perfect execution of the system Graves believed in. But now, sitting alone in his office in the dead of night, the silence was broken by the quiet hum of the building and the faint, almost imperceptible weight of the manila envelope on his desk. Ethan's request was a discordant note in the perfect symphony of procedure. It was illogical, pointless, a final act of, what, defiance? Insanity? He should have incinerated it. That would have been the proper procedural thing to do. It was an unauthorized communication. But he didn't. He stared at it. The calm, composed face of Ethan Cole burned into his mind. Why a chess game? Why send it to Alastair Finch, the victim's best friend? Graves let out a sigh of frustration. He despised loose ends. He despised anomalies. This request was an anomaly that threatened the sterile order of his final duty to inmate 1138. Against every instinct honed by 30 years of professional detachment, he picked up the envelope. He told himself it wasn't about the inmate. It was about his own need for closure, for restoring the order that had been so subtly disturbed. He would deliver the package. He would see this ridiculous task through, if only to prove to himself how utterly meaningless it was. Then, and only then, could he sign the final papers with a clear conscience, his belief in the system restored and intact. He slipped the envelope into his briefcase, a silent promise made to himself, and walked out into the cold pre-dawn air. The drive to Alistair Finch's home was a journey into another world. Warden Graves left behind the gray, oppressive geometry of the prison, the landscape of fences and concrete, and drove out into the rolling hills of the countryside. The world outside the prison walls was always a mild shock, a reminder of the life that continued, indifferent to the meticulous schedules of death he oversaw. He found Finch's address on a secluded tree-lined road. The house was old, made of dark stone and ivy, and looked as though it had grown out of the earth itself. It was the home of a man who did not seek the company of others. Graves, feeling conspicuously out of place in his severe suit, knocked on the heavy oak door. After a long moment, it was opened by a man who seemed as ancient as the house. Alistair Finch was tall and gaunt, with a wild mane of white hair and eyes that burned with a fierce, restless intelligence. He looked at Graves not with suspicion, but with an almost predatory curiosity, as if the warden were a complex new problem to be solved. "Warden Graves," Graves introduced himself, extending a hand that was not taken. "I know who you are," Finch said, his voice a dry rustle. "The news has been full of it. You're the man who is going to kill the person who murdered my friend. To what do I owe this unexpected visit?" "I have something for you," Graves said, his tone all business. He retrieved the manila envelope from his briefcase. "It's from the inmate, Ethan Cole. It was his final request." Finch's piercing eyes narrowed. He took the envelope, his long, slender fingers handling it with a surgeon's delicacy. He led Graves into a study that seemed to be built entirely of books. Every wall was a floor-to-ceiling shelf, crammed with volumes on history, philosophy, and most of all, chess. A beautiful, handcrafted chessboard sat on a table in the center of the room, the pieces frozen in a complex mid-game. The grandmaster slid open the envelope and slid out a single sheet of paper. He held it up to the light pouring through a large bay window. Graves watched him, expecting a look of confusion or perhaps contemptuous dismissal. Instead, Finch's expression transformed. His eyes, initially casual, began to scan the page with an electrifying intensity. His breath hitched. He walked over to the chessboard in the center of the room, his gaze darting back and forth between the paper and the pieces. He moved a pawn on the board, then a knight. He muttered to himself a string of algebraic notations that were meaningless to the warden. This is one of our games," Finch whispered, his voice filled with a strange mix of reverence and disbelief. He looked up at Graves, his eyes wide. "A variation Arthur and I debated for a decade. It was our secret obsession. We called it the Andromeda variation. Only he and I knew of it." He traced a line of notation on the page with a trembling finger. "But this This is different. The opening is ours, the middle game is ours, but the ending, I've never seen this before." He pointed to the final sequence of moves. Pawn to b4, then knight to c6. This move here. Finch's face went pale. "My God," he breathed. "The ghost gambit." "The what?" Graves asked, the first prickle of genuine unease running down his spine. "It was a code," Finch said, his voice barely audible. He stared at Graves, but his eyes seemed to be looking through him into a past the warden couldn't see. A theoretical sequence Arthur devised, a move so radical, so self-sacrificial, you would only play it if you were in a completely lost position. A move you make not to win, but to burn the board. He called it his plan of last resort, his ghost gambit, a way to disappear if everything was about to collapse. The warden stood frozen in the dusty, sunlit room, the smell of old paper and leather filling his lungs. The weightless manila envelope suddenly felt as heavy as a tombstone. A pointless game, a meaningless gesture. He had been so sure. But the look on the grandmaster's face was not one of a man observing a pointless game. It was the look of a man who had just seen a ghost. The world, as Warden Samuel Graves knew it, began to dissolve. It happened not in a crash of thunder, but in the quiet, methodical scratching of Alistair Finch's pen on a sheet of paper. Arthur and I were competitive rivals, but we were friends first, Finch explained, his hands moving with feverish energy. We played games through the mail for 30 years to keep things interesting and to keep our communications private from his corporate rivals. We developed a cipher. It was based on the board itself. He grabbed a dusty ledger from a shelf. Each square on the chessboard corresponded to a letter or a number based on a keyword we changed every month. The moves in the game weren't the message themselves. They were the key to decrypting it. Finch laid the sheet of chess notation next to the open ledger. His finger traced the final moves of the ghost gambit. Pawn to b4, knight to c6, rook to a8. To Graves, it was a foreign language, but as Finch translated, a horrifying new language began to form. Letters became numbers. Numbers became coordinates. Coordinates became a sequence. "This first sequence," Finch said, his voice tight with tension, "it's a bank. The Cayman Trust Peninsula." He scribbled furiously. "The second sequence, it's a routing number. The third is an account number." He paused, his pen hovering over the paper. "And this last sequence, it's a transaction date." He looked up at Graves, his eyes hollow. 2 days after Arthur Wallace was supposedly murdered. The air left the warden's lungs. The entire foundation of his reality, the neat, orderly black and white world of crime and punishment, cracked beneath his feet. "It can't be," Graves whispered, the words feeling like sand in his mouth. "There's more," Finch said, his voice grim. He pointed to the final 2 moves of the game, a simple king and pawn maneuver that signified checkmate on the page. He cross-referenced them with his ledger. A word began to form. Thorne. "Thorne!" Graves breathed, the name hitting him like a physical blow. Marcus Thorne, Ethan Cole's own defense attorney, the man whose job it was to prove his client's innocence. The truth, in its monstrous, brilliant simplicity, crashed down upon him. Arthur Wallace was not dead. He had seen the collapse of his financial empire coming, a massive Ponzi scheme the FBI would later discover, and he had executed his ghost gambit. He had faked his own death. He needed a scapegoat, someone to take the fall, to ensure no one would ever look for a living man. He chose Ethan Cole, a quiet, intelligent analyst he had recently fired, someone with a plausible motive and no resources to fight back. And to make sure the scapegoat could never speak, to ensure the system would silence him forever, Wallace had paid off the one man who could have saved him. Marcus Thorne, the court-appointed lawyer. He had buried evidence, ignored leads, and presented a defense so weak it was tantamount to a confession. He had delivered his own client to the execution chamber. Warden Graves stumbled back, his hand finding the edge of a heavy desk to steady himself. His unbreakable rule, his faith in the system, his 30 years of service, it was all a lie. He wasn't an administrator of justice. He had been made into a tool, a cog in a machine designed not to punish a monster, but to murder an innocent man. Ethan Cole was not a killer. He was a hero. Trapped, betrayed, and facing certain death, he hadn't wasted his energy on futile appeals. He had spent his final days composing a message, a brilliant, desperate checkmate from beyond the grave. He had placed his trust not in the system that had failed him, but in the intelligence of his enemy's oldest friend, and in the sliver of human curiosity he had sensed in the cold, procedural heart of his own executioner. Graves looked at his watch. The digital display seemed to mock him. He had less than 10 hours. 10 hours to stop the unstoppable machine he had served his entire life. The clock was no longer just a clock. It was a bomb, and the countdown had already begun. The system, Warden Graves discovered, did not like to be contradicted. It was a vast, inertial beast, and once set on a path, it resisted any attempt to alter its course. His first call was to the Attorney General's office. He was patched through to a junior aide whose voice dripped with condescending bureaucracy. "Warden, with all due respect," the aide said after Graves frantically explained the situation, "you're telling me that based on a coded chess game, we should halt a state-sanctioned execution that has been through years of appeals? Do you have any hard evidence?" "The evidence is coming," Graves barked into the phone, his voice echoing in Finch's silent study. An offshore bank account accessed by a dead man, a confession from a corrupt lawyer waiting to be extracted. "Warden, are you unwell?" the voice on the other end asked, a chillingly calm question. "The pressure of the job can be immense. The execution will proceed as scheduled. I strongly advise you not to interfere." The line went dead. His call to the governor's chief of staff was even shorter. He was dismissed as a crank, a man who had finally cracked under the strain. They saw him as the problem, a loose cannon threatening their carefully managed political narrative. He was alone. The system he had dedicated his life to was now his enemy, and its gears were grinding inexorably toward Ethan Cole. He looked at Alistair Finch, who was already on his own phone, speaking to financial contacts, trying to get immediate verification of the Cayman account. Then Graves looked at his watch again. 6 hours left. A cold, hard fury ignited in his chest. A lifetime of suppressed emotion, of empathy he had denied, of doubts he had crushed, roared to the surface. They thought he was just a cog in their machine. They had forgotten one crucial detail. For the next 6 hours, he was the machine, driving back to the prison at a speed that would have earned anyone else a fistful of tickets. He formulated a plan. It was insane. It was career suicide. It was a violation of every protocol he had ever written. It was perfect. He strode into the Central Command Center of Blackwood Prison, his face a mask of grim authority. The guards snapped to attention. "What's the situation, Warden?" his deputy asked. Graves didn't look at him. He walked straight to the master control panel, his eyes fixed on a large red, glass-covered button. The button for a code red lockdown. A button that had not been pressed in 15 years. "Warden?" his deputy asked again, a note of alarm in his voice. "There is an imminent, credible external security threat to this facility," Graves announced, his voice booming with an authority no one dared to question. "We are initiating a full lockdown, effective immediately." Before anyone could react, he smashed the glass cover with his fist and slammed his palm down on the red button. The world erupted in noise. Klaxons blared, their deafening shriek tearing through the prison's oppressive silence. Red lights flashed, painting the concrete walls in blood-red strobes. Steel doors slammed shut with percussive finality, sealing off every wing, every cell block, every corridor. The entire prison, a complex ecosystem of routine, ground to a screeching, chaotic halt. And with it, the execution protocol. Everything stopped. The preparation of the chamber, the final medical checks, the movement of the execution team. Everything. He had bought time, an hour, maybe two, before the state police and the governor's office descended on him, but it was time he desperately needed. In the pandemonium he had created, he retreated to his office, locked the door, and made one last call. He bypassed the state bureaucracy entirely, dialing a number he hadn't used in years, a direct line to a senior agent at the FBI's white-collar crime division, a man who owed him a favor. "David," Graves said, his voice urgent, "I'm sending you an email. You have to look at it now. I have a man who is legally dead laundering billions of dollars, and the state of is about to execute the only man who can prove it. You have less than an hour to get me a federal stay of execution." He hit send on the email containing Finch's decoded proof and the account numbers. Then he waited. The minutes stretched into an eternity, each tick of the clock a hammer blow, the sounds of the lockdown echoing outside his door. The phone rang. It was the direct line from the execution chamber. "Warden, the stay hasn't come through. The protocol dictates we must proceed once the lockdown is lifted." His blood ran cold. He had failed. And then his private line buzzed. He snatched it up. It was the FBI. "Sam, you madman!" Agent Miller's voice crackled. "The account is real. The transfers are real. A federal judge has just issued an emergency stay. It's on its way to you now. What the hell did you do?" A wave of relief, so profound it almost buckled his knees, washed over him. He stood up, his uniform disheveled, a small cut on his hand from the broken glass. He looked at the chaos he had unleashed, the system he had broken, and for the first time in 30 years, he felt like he had truly done his job. He walked out of his office, through the flashing lights and confused guards, and took a different path than he normally would on this night. He walked not toward the execution chamber, but toward the maximum security holding cells. He stood before Ethan Cole's cell. Ethan looked up, his face calm, questioning. Warden Graves met his gaze, and for the first time, he saw the man, not the inmate. He saw the brilliant mind, the unbreakable spirit. "The board has been reset, Mr. Cole," the warden said, his voice quiet but clear over the dying sirens. "It's a new game." 6 months later, the afternoon sun cast a warm glow over the chessboards in Washington Square Park. Two men sat opposite each other, lost in the silent, intricate dance of the 64 squares. One was an old man with wild white hair and eyes that still burned with intellectual fire. The other was a younger man, his face no longer bearing the weight of a countdown, but etched with a quiet, profound sense of peace. Ethan Cole, a free man, advanced his knight. Alistair Finch smiled and countered with his bishop. They were not playing for stakes, not for secrets, not for their lives. For the first time in years, Ethan was playing simply for the joy of the game. The news of Arthur Wallace's capture in a non-extradition country and Marcus Thorne's conviction for conspiracy and fraud was already fading into old headlines. All that mattered now was the next move. Miles away, in a world of concrete and steel, Warden Samuel Graves sat in his office. The office was different now. The framed copy of the state penal code was gone. In its place on the wall hung a small, elegant, handcrafted chessboard. He was reviewing an inmate's file, but his eyes were not just scanning the charges and the sentence. He was reading the personal history, the psychological evaluation, the letters from family. He was looking for the story behind the sentence, the human being behind the number. An orderly placed a small stack of mail on his desk. Among the official reports and memos was a simple postcard. It showed a picture of a sunlit park. There were no words, no signature. There was only a single, elegant line of algebraic chess notation printed in the message space. E2 to E4. The king's pawn opening, a classic beginning, an invitation to a new game. Graves looked at the postcard and then at the board on his wall. A small, genuine smile touched his lips. He knew, with a certainty that filled him not with fury, but with a quiet sense of purpose, that some rules were meant to be broken. In a world governed by rigid systems, true justice is sometimes the most rebellious act of all. For it is not the letter of the law that defines our humanity, but the courage to see the person behind the sentence and the will to make the one move that changes the entire game.